In 1909, a single family quietly bought up nearly every major pharmacy chain in America. Within a decade, the shelves of those pharmacies looked nothing like they had before. The herbs, the tinctures, the bark powders, the mineral compounds, the homeopathic remedies that had filled American drugstores for over a century, all of it vanished. In its place came petroleum-derived synthetics, patented chemicals, and a brand new word that nobody had used before: pharmaceuticals. The men who pulled this off were not doctors, they were not chemists, they had no background in healing whatsoever. They were oil refiners. By 1925, the same family controlled the medical schools, the licensing boards, the journals, the hospitals, and the very definition of what counted as medicine in the United States. Anything that did not come from a Rockefeller-funded laboratory was relabeled as quackery, witchcraft, or fraud. Doctors who refused to prescribe the new chemical drugs lost their licenses. Schools that taught the old methods were shut down or starved of money until they closed. And here is where it gets stranger. The architecture of those original pharmacies, the marble counters, the apothecary jars, the cast iron mortar and pestle on every corner, the buildings themselves, many of them dated back to a period that official history cannot fully account for. Some sat inside structures that locals swore were already there before the towns were officially founded. Some had Latin inscriptions carved above the doors that nobody alive could translate. Some had basements full of pharmacy equipment that did not match any catalogue of the era. Whatever was on those original shelves, whatever knowledge filled those leather-bound formularies, whoever built those strange old buildings, it was all replaced in the span of 15 years. And the replacement is what we now call modern medicine. If this kind of buried history pulls at you, the kind that does not appear in any textbook, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We post a new investigation every week, and the next one is already queued up on screen when this video ends. Watch it. The pieces only fit together when you have all of them. To understand what happened in 1909, you have to understand what came before it. And what came before it was a country that did not look anything like the one in the history books. In the 1880s, every American town of any size had a pharmacy. Not a chain pharmacy, not a corporate pharmacy, a real one, run by a man called the apothecary. He compounded medicines on site, he grew or imported his own herbs, he kept ledgers of every patient, every formula, every reaction. He answered to no government license because no government license existed. He was trained by another apothecary who was trained by another in a chain of knowledge that stretched back further than most people realize. The shelves of these pharmacies held thousands of substances: cinchona bark for fever, foxglove for the heart, willow bark for pain, mercury compounds for stubborn infections, gold salts, silver tinctures, sulfur powders, lobelia for asthma, golden seal, bloodroot, pokeweed, compounds with names like calomel, paregoric, bitter tonic, black drought. Some of these worked, some of them did not, some of them were dangerous, but they had been used, refined, and passed down for generations. And the pharmacies themselves were beautiful. Walk into any photograph from that era, and you see vaulted ceilings, polished hardwood, brass fittings, stained glass, marble counters, hand-blown glass jars labelled in Latin and Greek. The buildings looked like cathedrals of healing. Many of them had been built decades earlier in a style that historians now lump under terms like Italianate, Beaux-Arts, or Second Empire. The level of detail in the masonry, the quality of the materials, the precision of the joinery, none of it matches the population, the labour force, or the industrial capacity that the official record claims existed at the time of construction. Walk through small towns in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in upstate New York, in Tennessee, and you will still see some of these buildings standing. The pharmacy is gone, the bank is gone, the opera house is gone, but the shells remain, and they do not match the dirt road, horse and buggy America that school books describe. This is the world that John D. Rockefeller looked at in the late 1890s. He did not see beauty. He did not see craft. He did not see a healing tradition. He saw a problem. The problem was simple. Rockefeller controlled Standard Oil. Standard Oil refined petroleum. The refining process produced enormous quantities of waste. sticky black byproducts that nobody knew what to do with, coal tar derivatives, benzene rings, petroleum distillates, tons of it, every single day with no market. And then a chemist working in Germany made a discovery. He realized that those black sludge byproducts could be chemically rearranged into substances that mimicked the effects of natural medicines. The molecules were not the same. The bodies of patients did not respond to them in the same way. But they were close enough to fool a doctor and patentable in a way that herbs were not. You cannot patent foxglove. You can patent a synthetic copy of foxglove. Rockefeller saw what this meant immediately. The waste from his refineries, the trash he had been paying to dispose of, could be turned into the most profitable product in human history. But only if the existing pharmacy system was destroyed first. As long as Americans walked into apothecaries and bought tinctures of real plants for pennies, there was no market for $10 bottles of synthesized petroleum compounds. So in 1901, he set up something called the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. On paper, it was a charitable foundation dedicated to advancing science. In practice, it was the headquarters of a corporate takeover that would reshape an entire civilization. The first move was the medical schools. In 1908, Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie commissioned a man named Abraham Flexner to write a report on the state of American medical education. Flexner was not a doctor. He was a school teacher from Kentucky with no medical training of any kind. But he was paid handsomely, and he was given a clear assignment. Visit every medical school in America, rate them, and recommend which ones should survive. The Flexner Report came out in 1910. It was 364 pages long. It declared that the vast majority of American medical schools were inadequate, unscientific, and dangerous. It called for the closure of more than half of the 155 medical schools then operating. And it specifically targeted any school that taught anything outside of the new chemical drug model. Schools of homeopathy, eclectic medicine, naturopathy, herbalism, chiropractic, osteopathy, all of them were declared substandard. The report had no force of law, but it did not need one. Within 5 years of its publication, the schools it condemned began losing accreditation. State licensing boards, many of them now staffed with Rockefeller-aligned physicians, refused to license graduates of those schools. Banks refused them loans. Hospitals refused to accept their patients. The schools that survived were the ones that accepted Rockefeller and Carnegie funding. And that funding came with one absolute condition. The curriculum had to be rewritten around pharmaceutical drugs. By 1925, the number of medical schools in America had been cut roughly in half. The number of homeopathic schools went from 22 to 2. The number of schools teaching herbal medicine went from dozens to 0. An entire continent of healing knowledge was burned to the ground in less than 2 decades, and the men who held the matches were oil refiners. But the schools were only one front of the war. The pharmacies themselves were the other. Starting around 1909, a series of acquisitions began that nobody at the time understood as connected. A holding company would buy a regional pharmacy chain. A different holding company would buy another. A third entity, ostensibly unrelated, would buy out a wholesale drug supplier. Within a few years, when researchers later traced the corporate ownership back through the layers, they found the same handful of names at the top: Rockefeller, Morgan, Carnegie. The same circle of financiers who had built the railroad trust, the oil trust, the steel trust, was now quietly assembling a drug trust. The independent apothecaries, the ones who would not sell, were squeezed. The wholesale suppliers stopped delivering to them. The new chemical drugs, which were now being heavily advertised in medical journals, were sold only through approved chains. Insurance, where it existed, only paid for prescriptions filled at chain locations. Doctors trained in the new Rockefeller-funded schools only wrote prescriptions for the new chemical drugs. By the late 1920s, the American pharmacy had been transformed. The apothecary jars came down. The compounding counters were ripped out. The Latin formularies were thrown in the trash. In their place came rows of pre-bottled pills with brand names, manufactured in centralized factories, distributed by a small number of approved wholesalers, prescribed by doctors trained in a small number of approved schools, paid for by insurance through a small number of approved networks. And here is the detail that almost nobody notices. The buildings stayed. Walk into a CVS or a Walgreens or a Rite Aid in an old American town today and look up. Look at the ceiling. Look at the moldings. Look at the columns. Many of these chains occupy the original pharmacy buildings from before 1900. The fluorescent lights are new, the shelves are new, the plastic flooring is new, but the structure itself, the bones of the building, the stone, the brick, the elaborate cornices, the strange symmetry, all of it predates everything we are told about modern American architecture. The shelves of the old apothecaries became the bodies of the new drugstores. Only the contents changed. This is where the Tartarian thread enters the story, and this is where it gets harder to dismiss. For over a century, researchers outside the mainstream have noted that the architecture of late 19th century America does not match the official narrative of how that America was built. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 displayed an entire white city of marble palaces, said to have been constructed in less than 2 years by a labor force that had no electric tools, no modern cranes, and no reliable supply chains. The Capitol buildings of dozens of states feature domed rotundas, carved friezes, and statuary that by every modern estimate would take a decade to produce with hand tools. And many of these buildings, almost all of them, were said to have been completed in 12 to 18 months. Some researchers argue that these buildings were not built in the era they are dated to. They argue that an older civilization, one whose name has been scrubbed from the standard record, constructed them long before the official settlement dates of the cities they sit in. Whether or not you accept that thesis, one fact is undeniable. The pharmacies of the 1880s and 1890s were built to a standard of craft and material that does not match the construction industry of that period as we are told it existed. And inside those buildings before 1909 was a healing tradition that connected to something equally hard to explain. The American apothecary did not invent his own knowledge. He inherited it. He inherited it from a tradition that came across the Atlantic, from England, from Germany, from France. And those European traditions inherited theirs from older sources still. Arabic alchemy, Persian medicine, ancient Egyptian temple medicine. The old herbal compendiums that European apothecaries used in 1880 cited sources from 1,000 years earlier. Some of them cited sources that no longer existed in any library, with names and authors that historians could not verify. There was a continuity of knowledge, a river of healing wisdom that had been flowing for centuries. And in the span of 15 years, between 1909 and 1925, in one country, that river was diverted. Consider one specific example of what was lost. In 1899, the average American apothecary stocked something called Lloyd's specific medicines. These were preparations developed by a man named John Uri Lloyd, a pharmacist in Cincinnati, Ohio. Lloyd was not a fringe figure. He was the president of the American Pharmaceutical Association. He held 3 honorary doctorates. He published thousands of articles in scientific journals. His preparations were used in hospitals across the country. The Lloyd Library in Cincinnati, which still exists today, holds hundreds of thousands of books and manuscripts on botanical medicine, much of it inherited from his work. By 1925, Lloyd's specific medicines had been removed from the formularies of every major hospital in America. The preparations were not declared unsafe. They were not declared ineffective. They simply vanished from the approved lists. Doctors who continued to prescribe them found their hospital privileges revoked. The Lloyd Brothers Pharmaceutical Company, which had been one of the largest in America in 1900, was bankrupt by the late 1930s. The library survived only because Lloyd had been wealthy enough to endow it independently. If he had not, that knowledge would have been thrown into a dumpster, the way the records of hundreds of smaller apothecary firms were thrown into dumpsters when their buildings were sold to chain pharmacies in the 1920s and 30s. Multiply this story by 10,000. by every small-town apothecary whose ledgers were tossed when the building changed hands, by every family-owned pharmacy whose handwritten formularies, 3 or 4 generations deep, were sent to the landfill when the heirs sold to a chain. The total amount of empirical clinical data that was destroyed in that period is impossible to estimate. We can only say that it was vast, that it was systematic, and that it disappeared without a single act of arson, a single court order, a single official announcement. Why? The first answer is the obvious one: money. A patented chemical drug returns thousands of times more profit than a herb that anyone can grow in a garden. The Rockefellers and the men around them built the largest fortunes in human history on this single transformation. By 1955, the American pharmaceutical industry was generating more revenue than the entire automobile industry. By 1980, more than the defense industry. By the year 2000, the same families that had funded the Flexner Report controlled foundations that controlled medical schools, that controlled the licensing of every doctor in the country. But money is not the whole answer. There is something else. A patented chemical drug is not just more profitable than a herb, it is more controllable. A herb can be grown by a peasant in a garden. A chemical drug requires a factory, a chemist, a patent, a regulator, a distributor, a prescriber, and a payer. It requires an entire system. And once a population becomes dependent on that system, it becomes dependent on whoever controls the system. The traditional apothecary asked questions about the patient. He asked about diet. He asked about sleep. He asked about emotion. He asked about the patient's relationship with the land they lived on. The medicine he produced was made for that specific patient in that specific moment. The transaction was personal, local, and largely invisible to any outside authority. The pharmaceutical drug erases all of that. It does not care about the patient. It treats a code on a chart. It is identical from one bottle to the next. Every prescription is recorded, tracked, and reported to a central authority. The transaction is not personal, it is statistical. The patient does not exist as a human being. The patient exists as a data point in a database that grows larger every year. This is not just a different way of selling medicine. It is a different way of relating to the human body. And the men who designed it understood exactly what they were doing. There is a paragraph that appears in a 1913 internal memorandum from one of the Rockefeller advisory boards. It has been reproduced in several biographies and is not seriously disputed as a forgery. The paragraph reads roughly as follows: The aim of the foundation is not to cure individual disease, but to standardize the practice of medicine across the entire population, so that the methods of treatment, the substances used, and the training of practitioners can be uniformly directed from a central point. The standardization of medicine is the standardization of the population. That last sentence deserves to be read twice. The standardization of medicine is the standardization of the population. This was the project. Not better health, not longer life, not less suffering. Standardization. The replacement of 1,000 local healing traditions with a single centrally directed system. The replacement of 1 million unique patients with a single statistical body. The replacement of a continent of independent apothecaries with a handful of chain pharmacies, all selling the same products, all reporting to the same suppliers, all answering to the same authorities. And the architecture of the old pharmacies, the strange, beautiful buildings that had housed the old tradition, was simply absorbed. The shells were retained because they were too expensive to demolish. The contents were replaced, the signs were changed, the names were changed, and within a generation nobody remembered what had been there before. You can test this yourself. Find an old pharmacy building in an old American town. Many of them still operate as drugstores today. Walk in, look at the floor. In some of them you can still see, under decades of vinyl and tile, the original mosaic tile work with the pharmacy's original name, often in Latin. Look at the walls. Behind the modern shelving, some of them still have the original built-in cabinets, the brass railings, the hand-painted apothecary signs. Look at the ceiling. The pressed tin or carved plaster from a century ago is still up there, painted over a dozen times, but still up there. The old pharmacy is still inside the new pharmacy. The new pharmacy is built inside the corpse of the old. Now consider what was lost. The American apothecary tradition before 1909 included thousands of preparations that had been refined over centuries. Bitters for digestion, tonics for fatigue, compounds for nerves, for women's complaints, for children's coughs, for old age. Some of these were rooted in genuine pharmacology. The aspirin we still use today is a synthesized version of willow bark, which apothecaries had been selling for 2,000 years before the first chemist patented it. Quinine for malaria came directly from the apothecary tradition. Digitalis for heart failure came directly from the apothecary tradition. The list goes on, but hundreds of other compounds, ones that did not fit cleanly into the new chemical model, were dropped. Compounds with names like elixir of vitriol, syrup of squills, asafoetida pills, bismuth subnitrate, ergot of rye. Some of these may have been useless, but some of them almost certainly worked. And we will never know which was which, because the system that tested them was destroyed, and the practitioners who knew how to use them were driven out of the profession, and the schools that trained them were shut down or rebuilt around a different curriculum. The same is true of the entire homeopathic tradition. By 1900, there were 22 homeopathic medical colleges in America, 100 homeopathic hospitals, and over 15,000 homeopathic doctors. By 1923, all but 2 of the colleges were closed. By 1950, homeopathy had been driven so far underground that most Americans believed it had never existed in their country at all. A medical tradition with 2 centuries of clinical records and tens of millions of patients was, in the space of 50 years, declared not to exist. This is what a successful corporate takeover of a knowledge tradition looks like. The libraries are not burned. The libraries are simply ignored. The buildings are not torn down. The buildings are simply renamed. The practitioners are not killed. The practitioners are simply denied licenses, and their children are taught a different version of history. And then, after enough time has passed, even the memory of the takeover fades. The grandchildren of the apothecaries grow up not knowing their grandfathers existed. They walk past the old buildings every day without noticing the carved Latin above the door. They take the medicine the new system gives them and assume it has always been this way. The Rockefeller takeover of American medicine is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented sequence of corporate transactions, philanthropic foundations, regulatory captures, and educational reforms, every one of which can be traced through public records. The Flexner Report exists. The Rockefeller Institute exists. The grants to medical schools are listed in foundation annual reports going back over a century. The acquisitions of pharmacy chains are recorded in court documents and SAC filings. None of this is hidden. It is simply not taught. What is hidden is the question of what was taken. The full inventory of the apothecary tradition before 1909 has never been compiled. The full architectural record of the buildings that house that tradition has never been catalogued. The full network of practitioners, mentors, schools, and lineages has never been mapped. We know that something was there. We know that it was systematically replaced. We do not know in full detail what it was. This is what makes the Tartarian framing useful, even for those who do not accept its more dramatic claims. The Tartarian thesis, at its core, is the observation that something existed before the world we know, that it was not gradually evolved into the world we know, that it was replaced. The replacement happened in plain sight. The buildings remain. The records, partial and contradictory, remain. The descendants of the people who lived before the replacement are still alive, although they no longer remember what their grandparents knew. The Rockefeller pharmacy takeover is a small, specific, well-documented case study of exactly this pattern. A coherent tradition existed. It had its own architecture, its own knowledge, its own practitioners, its own products, its own economics, its own clientele. And then, in a span of about 15 years, it was bought, regulated, and rewritten out of existence. The buildings were repurposed, the names were changed, the history was reframed as a story of progress, with the old tradition cast as superstition and the new tradition cast as science. If this happened to American medicine in 1909, what else has it happened to? This is the question that Tartarian researchers have been asking for 30 years. They have asked it about the architecture. They have asked it about the population numbers. They have asked it about the dates of city foundings. They have asked it about the technology that the official record cannot explain. They have asked it about the maps that show countries that no longer appear in atlases, with names like Tartaria, Grand Tartary, Cathay, Magna Tartaria, all of them present on European maps as recently as the 1700s, all of them gone by the early 1800s. The pharmacy story is not the whole answer, but it is a piece of the answer. It is a piece small enough and recent enough and well documented enough that you can verify it for yourself. Look up the Flexner Report. Look up the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. Look up the pharmacy chain acquisitions of the 1910s and 1920s. Walk into an old drugstore in an old town and look at the building. The evidence is in plain sight, the way it always is when a takeover happens slowly enough that nobody panics. The men who did this are dead. The foundations they created are not. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, all of them still operate, still distribute billions of dollars in grants, still influence which medical research gets funded and which does not, still shape the curriculum of medical schools, still own large blocks of stock in the pharmaceutical companies that descend directly from the petroleum derivative industry their founders built. The system has not stopped, it has only matured. The drugs have changed names, the packaging has changed colours, the marketing has changed channels, but the basic architecture, a small number of corporations controlling a small number of products, distributed through a small number of approved outlets, prescribed by a small number of approved practitioners, paid for through a small number of approved insurers, remains exactly as it was designed in the second decade of the 20th century. What was on the shelves before 1909 is gone. The buildings that house those shelves are still here, although most of them have been gutted, repainted, and fitted with fluorescent lights. The knowledge that filled those shelves still exists, scattered across old books in private libraries, in the memories of a few elderly herbalists in rural America, in the surviving homeopathic clinics of India and Germany, in the traditional pharmacy practices that were never fully eradicated in places like Mexico and the Philippines and rural Greece. But in America, in the country where the takeover was most complete, the tradition is mostly a ghost. You can feel it in the old buildings. You can see it in the carved Latin above the doors. You can sense it in the strange beauty of the architecture that does not match the era it was supposedly built in. But you cannot walk into a pharmacy and ask for a tincture of bitter root for indigestion. The man behind the counter would not know what you were talking about. The shelves do not carry it. The system that produced it no longer exists. A whole world was replaced. The old shelves remained. The new contents were poured in. And within 2 generations, the people who lived in the new world had forgotten there had ever been an old one. This is how civilizations are quietly overwritten. Not by armies, not by bombs, by foundations, by reports, by regulations, by the slow, patient acquisition of every node in a network until the network itself belongs to a single hand. The Rockefellers did it to American medicine. The same pattern, applied to architecture, to history, to language, to memory itself, would explain a great deal of what Tartarian researchers have been pointing at for years. Whatever was here before 1909 was not built by us. The men who replaced it knew that. They left the buildings standing because the buildings were too well made to tear down. They knew the buildings were stronger than the new system they were installing. They counted on the new system being maintained by enough generations of forgetting that by the time anyone looked up at the carved stone above their head, they would have no language left to read it with. But the stone is still there. The Latin is still there. The mosaic floors are still there, under the vinyl. The vaulted ceilings are still there, under the drop tiles. The whole city of the old apothecary is still there, hiding inside the bright plastic shell of the new drugstore. You only have to learn how to see it, and once you have learned to see it, you cannot unsee it. The shells of an older world are everywhere around us, repurposed, repainted, renamed. The takeover never finished. It just stopped being noticed. That is the real story of 1909. Not just a pharmacy chain, not just a family of oil men, not just a series of corporate acquisitions, but a transfer of memory, a transfer of authority, a transfer of the right to define what counts as healing and what counts as quackery, what counts as history and what counts as myth, what counts as real and what counts as imaginary. The Rockefellers did not invent modern medicine. They installed it. And what they installed it inside of, the buildings, the bones, the underlying structure of the country, was already there, built by hands we are no longer told about, in a world that the official record refuses to acknowledge ever existed. The question is not whether you trust the medicine on the shelves today. The question is, what was on the shelves before? And once you start asking that question, every old building in every old town starts to whisper an answer the textbooks never gave.